My name is Mark Prince. I've been in the utility industry, strictly power plants, instrument controls for about 41 years. About 10 or 11 years ago, when the SIP thing rolled up, for you that don't know, critical infrastructure protection is mandatory compliance with federal laws for cybersecurity reliability in all North American power plants that are connected to the grid at 100 kV or more. In about a 6 to 24 month cycle, we constantly have new SIP requirements, additional requirements, lots of reporting and demonstration of compliance, and it's everything. It's patches, patch status, patch sources, antivirus backups, it goes on. And we even have new requirements that went into effect in October for supply chain security, and they're getting pretty rigorous. And I would say in the last 7 or 8 years, we're getting more and more requests from OEMs. They want remote access to the systems. That becomes an issue, especially with more and more OEM control system vendors using offshore people for that remote access. So we've got increasing threats, a lot of O&M cost pressure. We got more requirements. We need to put in more tools. We need more people, but they're telling me to do it with less O&M. So that's why they call it a JOB, right? Also, for us down on the Gulf Coast area, a lot of new generation and transmission assets being constructed. There's load growth on the Gulf Coast that requires new generation and replacing the aging fleet. All these plants, some of them that started up in the 60s are still running. We got to slowly replace those. So this slide says 2015, but this story really starts in about 2013 when we were looking at SIP version 4 was coming, and that was going to apply to plants. And we had about 6 of these big medium plants greater than 1,500 megawatts. And that version 4 eventually got canceled and became version 5. So we start looking at our plants. We have every control system out there, and that's just a few on that slide. There's a more comprehensive list later in the presentation. So the companies like GE, Emerson Ovation, Emerson Delta V, ABB, Metso, you got your Rockwell stuff, your Mitsubishi, Toshiba, and the list goes on and on. So we approached the OEM vendors of the systems and said, hey, let me get to that in a minute. What is your solution for the tools to help us meet compliance for SIP? We had a small team. We started a department of geographically dispersed OT engineers that serviced plants in a 4-state area. And then while we're diving into this to figure out how we're going to become compliant and secure and reliable all at the same time, our CIO comes to me and says, hey, we're going to put data diodes on all the facilities as well, which means no remote access whatsoever. And we did. But we had to figure that out too. There was a shortage of engineering firms in North America that really knew how to implement them. A few people in nuclear, but not many. So we had to figure that one out too. So this is an example of our footprint. It's Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Southeast Texas. I'm not involved in nuclear. It was all gas, coal, hydro, petcoke, different various fuel types in the mix. So our needs were to achieve NERC SIP compliance, which what I call the fundamentals. You need software inventory and a way to deploy patches. Backup and restore was the Achilles heel in our company anyway. The plants were all pretty siloed and they didn't have backup and restore for hardly anything. Maybe 1 or 2 plants had a conscientious engineer that was doing that. Malicious software prevention tools, we call them in our world, MSPT, whether you use whitelisting or signature-based. And we needed to be able to do configuration change monitoring. And it's a good SIEM, something to monitor syslog and do alerting based on things that happen in the syslog events. when we went to all these different ABBs, GEs, all these guys, we realized that for each of those fundamentals, they all used a different tool. So for example, I got one plant with say GE turbo controls, and it's got ABB 800XA boiler and balance of plant controls. And then it's got a bunch of Rockwell stuff for like herder management, safety systems, things like that. If I go to 3 or 4 different vendors, for example, in the SIM world, they all use a different tool. They all use a different tool for backup and restore. They all use a different tool for MSPT. And we just quickly realized that we can't just put a different tool from every manufacturer on every control system. We couldn't manage it. You know, you'd have to learn 5 different SIMs and, you know, 5 different backup and restore systems. So we went on the quest of finding someone that could do things from an agnostic point. In other words, we wanted the same exact tools put on every single control system. And when our people went to each plant, they were dealing with the same tools all over it. All I had to know difference was the plant, IP addresses and credentials. And we didn't have remote access, you know, so we people have to travel to these plants. You had to carefully geographically disperse those employees. We were told you're never going to find this. No one can do this. No one's willing to do it. But I figure 50 years ago, they could fly to the moon, hit a golf ball, and come back to eat dinner with their family. We could find a way to do this if we had to do it ourselves. So we developed a very complicated bid specification. There were 7 bidders, including Verve Industrial, who we ended up picking. We needed vendor agnostic. In other words, what we ran into was people like Emerson or ABB. They were like, yeah, we'll try this out. We will do other people's systems. But when it came down to it, there was some anxiety from those vendors. I don't blame them, because you're touching your competitor's system and throwing software on it and making network connections that vendor may not approve of. And we will also, part of that spec was a centralized data repository. In other words, you know, CM logs, especially software inventories for patch discovery and evaluation, which is federal law, has to happen every 30 days. We do it every 15 days. It's very laborious. It's an entire department to do that for over 2,500 pieces of software across the fleet. We wanted a single console in the plant to see the metrics or the data from each of the tools. I want to see if all my USBs, say I'm using Bit9, Carbon Black, I'm using it for application whitelisting and the lockdown USB ports. I want to be able to see that and my backups and all of that stuff in one application, even though there's multiple tools in the background doing it. It was a big challenge, and this vendor was the only one that really had all of that and was willing to implement their solutions on any control system. They had already done many of them, and we've done a lot more. And at that same time, we were implementing the diodes across all of the facilities. We started a multi-year schedule, and started implementation across sites, you know, sequenced them in. We bought a 2,000 megawatt plant. At one point, we only had 6 weeks to get it compliant. We've done all of these implementations on running plants. You just got to know what you're doing. Mostly, you got to know what not to do. So the key features are where we ended up. We actually have agnostic implementation across Emerson Ovation, Delta V, GE Mark 5, Mark 6, Mark 6E, ABB, all the factory talk stuff, RS Logic, Mitsubishi turbine controls, Toshiba turbine controls, Metso DNA, and there's more that Verve has done for other customers that I wasn't involved in, obviously, but and not having to deal with these separate security suites for each system. We also find that some of those OEMs, their solutions, let's say, they don't meet all functionality we need for compliance. We want to automate things. For example, it's easy to automate backups for hard drives on computers, but we wanted automated daily backups of network appliances, relays, and these vendor had a solution for all of that. That is huge, to automate and do change detection for all of your network appliances and relays in a plant. Host down, host up alerts. We sometimes know when a computer goes down before the plant even knows it, because we get that message real quick on our phone. I just lost my screen, guys. Can y'all hear me?
We can still hear you, and your slides are still showing up on the screen. So,
yeah, it's like my monitor is going through a reboot. But anyway, it'll be nice when it comes back. Okay, here we go. We have a single agent. We can prove and test on all the OEM systems. We have never had an impact on operations. We have actually been installing this stuff while an OEM was doing an upgrade, and they would have a problem, and we were that wild card. They could say, y'all did it, and it's never turned out. It was always something they had a problem with, and as a matter of fact, our vendor would usually help them fix their problem. So we truly have a single console, and you're going to see a little touch of it in just a minute. It's also a lower cost versus hiring 6 or 8 vendors versus one vendor to manage the agnostic solution and supply us with updates and teach us how to use the software and the systems. So key features. Get to that slide. I was there. Okay. We do have all the automatic backups, the host up, host down, logging and alerting if someone changes the configuration, lock down USB ports, and the list goes on and on. And then we have what we refer to the software stack, and it kind of deviates over time, but that's what this is right here. And basically, it's going to be a SIEM, backup and restore for network appliances, backup and restore for computers, application whitelisting, or if you use signature-based malware protection. But the key is the enterprise reporting. So every hour or two, we have a server behind our diode that sends the data to an outside server, and we can log into that server and see, for example, across, say, 10 or a dozen plants, I need to know everywhere Adobe Reader version, whatever, is installed. We can just do a simple search, and it shows us every device in every plant that contains that piece of software. And for the discovery and evaluation for SIP patching requirements, that is crucial. So this is an example of a dashboard where it's showing all, these are kind of real fancy metrics, but each one of these you can dive into. On this, you can see all the PLCs at a plant. I can see firmware versions. I can see how many of each, say, virtual machines versus physical machines, brand names. Like I said, inventory software is key, very important if you have a large SIP fleet, plants that fall under SIP requirements. This is probably my favorite feature when we got all this working, that we could, our people that do the discovery could always know 100%. Before we had this, we would actually send people to the plant to do a fresh big fix dump and make 100% sure we had the latest versions. Well, now we've got them centrally all the time. I don't know of anyone else that can pull this off, but I just know it works for us. Also, as all the software inventory, the ports, you know, we're also see all the open logical ports, UDP and TCP ports, and then load CVE databases and get the vulnerability scans, you know, without a bunch of network taps and things like that. This is a more passive method. Backup and restore, like I said, it's really an Achilles heel in that industry. It's never been thing to do because the plants really don't have the skills for this stuff. But knowing when a backup fails anytime, because I've personally spent many, many days of my career rebuilding workstations because I didn't have backups. So it's near and dear to my heart. In the end, the results are what we've been talking about: to manage OT security and compliance across dozens of sites centrally, without remote access. Of course, you know, I got to send people to the plant for many functions, but we know when we need to send them. Lower labor costs. Senior management comes and says, we want to see your vulnerabilities that you have across the fleet. We can do them now instantly. Looking for software versions. We have reduced cost of relay techs by being able to remotely view a relay configuration, for example, that was backed up, and then we can push that configuration automatically. We do, to that central server. So a guy, instead of going to 20 substations or 5 plants, he can log on to a remote server and see those configurations to check the settings. And then, of course, the automated backups of all computers, appliances, and relays. And, you know, this has been a years-long venture, about 10 or 11 years for me. And in the end, I have a few recommendations. And it's kind of what Mario was saying, don't just think security. You know, you need to be efficient and reduce the labor requirements. Like he talked about, reducing the number of tools you use, and that is very important. Vendors today are coming to us and say, hey, we got a solution for your plant. They got so many tools, and they got network taps, and they're doing, you know, packet level inspection on gigabit Ethernet, and that's all cool, but I don't have to have that. I've got to get the basic fundamentals of security and compliance, and then keep them working and be able to prove it on any given day that I'm doing it. The vendor-agnostic thing, you know, make sure your tools are going to work at as many different places as possible. Do not fall for OEM threats. When you start throwing all this equipment and the software, mainly it's software agents on these systems, like, well, it's just all the OEMs that make the control systems for the power industry, which in many cases are the same across the industry. They will try to tell you, you can't do that. We're not going to warranty your system, Well, just don't fall for that stuff. Remember, you're the customer, they're the vendor, and you own the system. And if you fix it, if you break it, then if I break it, then I'll fix it. We still have the OEMs trying to pull that on people and trying to keep them from going somewhere else. Work with a team that has a lot of cross-vendor ICS engineering capabilities, especially in networking. When you implement these systems, there's a lot of careful network configuration that goes on to do it right. And people that understand how the networks in these control systems work. There are many of these systems that have modifications that they're not traditional networks. For example, on a lot of systems, you can't do deep port scans. You will trip the controllers, and there's people trip plants doing that. So you got to be a little more cautious about things like that, and just don't overcomplicate things. You know, there's a bunch of fancy new tools, and there's nothing wrong with any of them. But if you start putting in more and more tools, it's more and more stuff to manage. Just focus on the fundamentals of your endpoint management and keep things simple. And I think for us, it's worked out. We've gone back and forth and had to come backwards a couple of times to really get things simple. The future, we've got a lot of things coming out here. The IoT connections, the Internet of Things, they got all these super cool little instruments with embedded LTE chips in them. And plant managers or engineers find out a vendor's been installing them and reaching out to the internet, sending their machine data when they didn't even know it was happening. As you guys know, we've got an increasing number of ICS-related vulnerabilities. The thing in Florida, I don't know if y'all know about the keyloggers that were found on the SCADA system in Ohio recently. And then, of course, the supply chain risk. trying to fight, you know, management for the O&M to keep this stuff working. And in the power business, reliability is king. It is, besides safety, reliability is the most important, and they do go hand in hand. And that's about it. This is, if anyone wanted, we provided this. This is a lot of the SIP requirements that we deal with. A lot of those overarching things that Mario talked about, they're all buried in the 485 pages of SIP requirements. And that's all I've got, and I'll be around to ask questions later, answer questions later.
Thank you, Mark. Really good presentation. I like how you bring out the issues of finding a vendor-agnostic solutions. I think the installed base continues to be pretty diverse and various versions and ages of systems out there, which makes it a real challenge.